Your shabby clothes got an upgrade to high-end style thanks to the splash of fine wine. Isn't that nice? The one who spilled a glass of wine on me and had the nerve to say that was, of all people, the mother of the man I'm about to marry. She's got another thing coming if she thinks this rudeness will be tolerated. Wipe that smug look off your face. My name is Patricia. I'm a 25-year-old single office worker at a mid-sized company. I find my job enjoyable and fulfilling, and my relationships with my coworkers are good. I've been considering that I'd like to continue my work even after getting married. If I have a child, I'll take maternity leave, then return to work once things calm down. I've been considering that kind of plan. Suddenly, the idea of marriage has become a tangible part of my future. Indeed, I was proposed to by my boyfriend of 2 years just recently. We spent time at a fancy restaurant with a beautiful night view, and I noticed my boyfriend, Robert, unusually silent, his eyes darting around without settling on anything. Even at the observation deck with a beautiful night view afterward, he was still suspiciously looking around, heaving sigh after sigh. Finally, I couldn't bear his unnaturalness and opened my mouth. "Are you gonna propose?" Of course, I could tell. After 2 years together, one can figure it out. At that moment, his face turned red, his mouth opening and closing without uttering a word. I worried he might faint from lack of oxygen. So I told him to take a deep breath. Then, as if he had made up his mind, he took out a ring from his pocket and proposed to me. Whoa! Remembering the situation, I let out a strange sound and held my head. I was fine at that moment because the atmosphere was pushing me, but when I sober up and return to everyday life, I can't help but feel embarrassed about my behavior and his expression at that time. I am too socially inept. I have to remember not to get carried away. Marriage is just the start, I remind myself. But whenever I let my guard down, I can't help but grin, and my colleagues call me creepy. But in my current lovesick state, I don't care about such comments. Now, when it comes to marriage, the first step is to meet each other's parents. I broke the news to my parents while having breakfast. I'm getting married. So, that's it. Oh, is that so? Was all it took for the announcement to be made. Just like that, they are finished. What considerate parents I have. Being the third child out of 4, I guess this is what I can expect. But, we did have a nice beef stew for dinner. The real issue is his family. When we announced our engagement, it seems they demanded we come over to their house right away. Whoa, should we go? I worried, but he assured me, saying, if there's any discussion to be had, we can handle it when both families meet. I was relieved, but I was also worried that they might say, you should at least come to give a proper greeting. After all, he's from a wealthy family. I only found this out recently. His dad is the CEO of a well-known corporation that everybody recognizes. When I expressed my concern and asked if everything would be all right, he didn't reassure me. He was furrowing his brows. He confessed, my family, they have their quirks. He continued, like I said before, my dad's company is quite large, founded by my great-grandfather. Yeah, you mentioned that before. My dad's pretty humble about it. He says it's not him who made the company great, but our ancestors and the employees. The real problem is my mom and older sister. Despite his pedigree, he speaks casually. I just give him a bitter smile and say, is that so? Anyway, their flaunting of their wealth is pretty bad. I mean, I went to a public school from elementary to high school, and my mom would always look down on other parents, saying something ridiculous like public schools are for poor people. Really? Well, elementary and middle school are one thing, but the high school I went to was a fairly competitive public one. I chose it because I liked it. Thankfully, my friends were good to me, and I never had any issues, but it seems there were rumors among the parents that my mom was a handful. It was pretty embarrassing. What did your mom do? Apparently, she said to the other parents at a PTA meeting, you poor commoners. Well, I'm one of those poor commoners. Suddenly I felt anxious, thinking my family might be treated as poor. He continued his story. My sister has a similar attitude and openly insists on associating only with the affluent. She even laughed when saying she had cut ties with all her school friends because none of them were rich. That's rather harsh. That's why I'd rather not meet at our house. I think they'd behave in a public place, especially when your parents are present. but I just want to warn you. I apologize in advance if my mother or sister say something inappropriate." Seeing Hiro's worried face, I reassured him by thumping my chest and saying with a smile, "Don't worry about it." But in reality, I was far from okay. The day of the meet and greet had arrived. The venue was a private room in an upscale restaurant that Robert had reserved. My parents looked nervous, but I was likely the most nervous one there. After all, compared to my parents who have lived a long life, I've seldom been to such places. I had arrived at the restaurant first and was thinking that when Robert and his family promptly arrived, we were ushered into the room. There, Robert and I announced our marriage to all our family members and bowed our heads in a polite request for their blessings. In response, my parents said, "Congratulations, Robert. Please take care of Patricia," my father said. My mother added, "Congratulations to you both. Be happy." What I was most worried about was Robert's family, but his father had a gentle look on his face and seemed like a very kind person, which reassured me. "Congratulations, Patricia. Our son may be a bit raw around the edges, but we hope you will take good care of him," he said. But it didn't stop there. The trouble started with the mother-in-law I had heard about in advance. You have a plain face. Aren't you mismatched with Robert?" She bypassed the greeting and went straight into assessing me. My parents and I were taken aback. But the surprises were just beginning. Here comes the second arrow. The sister-in-law says, "Like, I can't believe you're marrying someone so ordinary. She definitely doesn't have any fancy friends, does she? If she knew a handsome rich guy, I wish she would have introduced me." As we stood there stunned, Robert quickly tried to smooth things over by saying, well, let's enjoy the meal first," but he couldn't change the awkward atmosphere that had developed. The two who were to be my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, unlike Robert and his father who were dressed in normal suits, had full-blown hair and makeup, to say the least, flashy. Their accessories were adorned with large gemstones, making me wonder if they weren't too heavy. Their makeup was a bit too much. Not only their clothes, but their handbags, watches, and all the items they wore were high-end brand goods. What can I say? Each item is probably wonderful in its own right, but when they all come together at once, it creates a sort of traffic jam of brands and it just seems out of place. That's what I learned having these two in front of me. I initially thought we wouldn't get along, but I reconsidered. Enduring is also an important part of marriage. It's not as much as it used to be, but two strangers can't suddenly become a real family. So, get to know my partner's family little by little. Such noble thoughts of mine were completely overlooked. The arrows kept coming. "You're really plain, aren't you? Hey, what brand is that dress? Oh, this isn't particularly a brand. Seriously. I can't believe it. It's the worst having you as a sister-in-law." Getting to know my partner's family little by little. "She doesn't look like she has any money at all, does she? You don't think she's after your money, do you? I wonder if the neighbors might mistake her for a maid every time she comes over. Oh, I just can't stand the thought. Maybe you should reconsider, Robert. Find someone more high class, don't you think? A girl who can introduce me to a handsome, rich guy would be ideal in my book." "That's right, just like what your sister said. Look at that face. She looks just like some poor folk. This is just hopeless." This was like a battlefield, with arrows of insults flying everywhere. There was no way I could negotiate peace in this situation. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the faces of our parents slowly turning sour. I could see my father's eyebrows furrowing. Robert's face was even redder than when he proposed. He must be really pissed off. But he was trying his best not to ruin the mood with his anger. Even more so than his flushed face, it was the two people in front of me whose faces were beet red. I thought we were just having some sushi and wine, but his mother and sister had nearly finished all of the expensive wine. And they were even asking for more. They were clearly drunk. "I've never heard of that company. An office worker at a place like that? That's hilarious." I wish someone would take an hour to explain to me what's so funny about it. According to Robert, his sister's current social status was housework trainee. An endangered species indeed. But why could she insult me, who's actually working? His mother was just as outrageous as always. "How much is your salary? I hope it's not less than $10,000. If your annual income is $10,000, that would be so funny. For your information, my husband's monthly income is, oh, I won't say. I wouldn't want you to have a heart attack from the shock. I could feel my blood boil as Robert tried desperately to stop his mother and sister, but they were too drunk to stop. And then, the drunken high-class mother and sister reached their limit and exploded. I've had enough. I don't need a sister like this. Call off the marriage, his sister exclaimed, holding her nearly full wine glass. His mother also raised her wine glass. You really look like some kind of poor person. This is unthinkable, simply unthinkable. I can't let my precious son marry someone like this. So, we're not allowing this marriage, she shouted. Just after I let out a surprised, eh? It was all I could manage before I heard a splashing sound. Something was dripping from my hair. Eh? It was wine. They had thrown their wine in my face. The room fell silent, except for the smell of wine spreading through the air. After a moment of silence, well, Patricia, at least your cheap clothes now look high-end after being drenched in our fine wine. You should be happy. Really now? Wasting such high-quality wine on a woman who's clearly after our son for his money. What a waste. The room was filled with their laughter. What the hell are you doing, Mom, sis? Robert, his face red with anger, slammed the table. But the two of them just kept on drinking their wine, looking unrepentant. How could you two be so rude? Apologize. His father, his face pale with anger, tried to intervene. But they just ignored him. That's when it happened. My mother, who had been silently wiping me clean, yelled, "Stop this nonsense. Apologize to my daughter." The atmosphere in the room suddenly grew heavy. After an uncomfortable silence, my father put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Let's go home, Patricia. Discuss the future with Robert later." Okay. There's no way I could stay here any longer anyway. Looking at the wine stain spreading across the floor, I was on the verge of tears, contemplating the need for compensation. Patricia, I'm sorry. I really am. My stupid mother and sister. Robert was quick to apologize, but another voice interrupted him. Get out, get out. You poor folks should just leave. It was his sister. Upon hearing her, my father, who had been holding my hand, stopped in his tracks. Then he slowly turned around. His glaring gaze startled her and she made a worried face. My father had an overwhelming presence. What's your problem, you poor people? But his sister glared back defiantly. To her, my father smirked and said, Well, consider this either a warning or advice. You probably won't believe me, but I'll say it anyway. Huh? Do you realize how much the world must hate you? What? What are you talking about? There's a bunch of nasty spirits gathering around you. I can't tell if they're ghosts or thoughts, but they're all shrouded in something very dark. What? You're talking nonsense. You really think I'd believe such nonsense? I'm not asking you to believe me. You'll probably feel more convinced when something strange happens. That's all. What, something strange? To the flustered sister, my father continued his words. I don't know if it's going to be an illness or some misfortune. But you'll see the results soon enough. Thanks to this ability of mine, I've saved many people. I've seen a lot who came crying to me because they didn't listen to my advice. I wonder how it'll turn out for you. If it had been just his words, his sister and mother probably wouldn't have believed him. They would have laughed it off. But the seriousness in my father's eyes, his heavy tone didn't allow for that. They turned pale. This is a joke, right? It's as true as the wine you've spilled. I have no reason to advise you who treated my daughter terribly, but I can't bear to see the family of a man who may become my son-in-law fall into misfortune. Pushed by that intensity, his mother and sister began to tremble. Behind the two, my father pointed and said, The woman with the perm and the brunette over there. You'd better apologize if you remember them. Ah! How do you know about them? As his mother and sister screamed in terror, we left the scene. The day after that crazy meeting, Robert came rushing to our house. He apologized and promised to cut ties with his mother and sister. This raised Robert's stock in our house. Then, a few days later, his mother and sister showed up at our house asking for forgiveness. We're very sorry. Of course, I was surprised to find two people asking for forgiveness on my doorstep when I got home from work. The two of them, his mother and sister, begging in front of my perplexed mother. My father, standing to the side with a stern look on his face and arms crossed. What's going on? Then my mother-in-law suddenly yells in front of me. I got seriously sick just as you said. I felt a bit off, so I got tested and was shocked. They told me that I would have been in serious trouble if they found it any later. His sister also chimed in. I thought I found a great guy, but he turned out to be a marriage scammer. After you warned us of some impending misfortune, I got suspicious and hired a private investigator. I was about to fall prey to him if I hadn't listened to your advice. Then, in harmony, the two of them apologized for their impertinence. My father was lounging around casually, looking down at the two of them. Like some kind of tough guy with a vape in his mouth. In a low voice, he told them. You two are apologizing to the wrong person, aren't you? Shouldn't you be apologizing to someone else first? Otherwise, the evil spirits won't leave you alone and more bad luck will follow. His sister panics. Turns around to apologize to me. I'm so sorry, Patricia. I was wrong. I've learned the hard way that money isn't everything in life. His mother also apologized her rudeness. I'm sorry for how I treated you, especially since you are the daughter of a man with such incredible abilities. I'm convinced that you and Robert will build a wonderful family together. Your child might even inherit your father's unique skills. I fully support your marriage. Congratulations. Well, these two are quick to change their tune. This situation. It's a bit of a bother to have people begging for forgiveness, but there's some kind of pleasure in seeing these two like this. Probably because they had treated me so badly. I was overcome with the urge to give the back of their heads a good stomp, but being the mature person I am, I resisted. And then I said, that's enough. The past is the past, but please apologize to that fancy restaurant, okay? They had to clean up after you. Of course, I've already told them we'll pay for the damages. Robert and I are going to get married as planned, but we're done dealing with you too. That's fine, right? What? My words must have taken them by surprise. Both of them let out a gasp. Didn't Robert tell you? The two of you are going to be living separately from now on. Patricia, you'll be living somewhere else, right? Of course. I mean, I'll be living in a different place, but that's not what I... Huh? Robert and his father discussed and decided that both of you would have to leave the house. What? You didn't know? Robert was furious. He couldn't forgive terrible family like you. And his father agreed with him and decided to throw you out of the house as a way of teaching you a lesson. What are you talking about? Oh, they really didn't know. That's right. My father-in-law kept apologizing for spoiling them. He said I am going to re-educate them by pushing them into an environment where they could only get by on the bare minimum. He also said to me I won't get them involved with any of your business going forward. We didn't hear anything about this. I see, they didn't know. By the way, ladies. I saw a big fancy car parked down the street earlier. Oh, that's ours. Our driver should be waiting in it. Well, he threw your luggage out and drove off. His mother dashed out of the gate and onto the street. There were 2 Boston bags and what looked like a letter. She hastily read the letter and collapsed on the spot. What's going on, Mom? What does it say? His sister snatched the letter and started to read. As she read, her eyes widened in shock. Wait, we're supposed to live here. Where is this place? It's 3 stops away on the train. A train? Now is not the time for silly questions. If you look at the letter, it tells you where you're supposed to live from now on. I looked up the address on my phone, and, well, it's pretty old. It's a rundown apartment, to put it mildly. Oh, here are the keys to your new place and some money for living expenses. This is barely enough. This won't even last a day. From my perspective, it's enough to live on for quite a few months. With that amount, I can't believe she said it wouldn't last half a day. She yelled and collapsed on the spot. But we can't have them sitting here forever. I called a cab while they were still in a daze, told the driver where to go, and sent them on their way. They were so stunned they didn't put up any resistance. They just let it happen. Just before the taxi started moving, my dad said, "You girls need to reflect on yourselves and get your lives straight. If you don't, you're gonna invite more trouble. I bet you wouldn't like getting sick or not finding boyfriends." Those words turned the 2 girls even paler, and they were shaking their heads vigorously. "What are you, bobbleheads?" Afterwards, it seems the two of them are half crying, screaming in their shabby apartment. They sometimes turn to my father-in-law or Robert for help, but they're told they're not welcome. Apparently, they can't get rid of their old spending habits, and the living expenses given to them vanish in no time. Well, that's to be expected. Suddenly living an average life isn't something they can handle. I wonder if the day they truly repent will ever come. His sister should get a job, she's still young. Don't look down on your part-time colleagues as commoners. As for me, I successfully registered my marriage with him. I'm not particularly fond of flashy weddings, so I just held a garden party with a few family members and friends. But seeing me dressed up in the wedding dress, my parents shed tears of joy, and even Robert complimented me, saying I looked beautiful. That's more than enough for me. We are doing well, having very few troubles in our marriage. We share same sense for money. There's nothing to worry about. And finally, we were blessed with a child. When I went back home for childbirth, I suddenly remembered something and asked my father. "By the way, Dad, I didn't know you had a sixth sense. Are there any spirits around me? I've been having severe shoulder pain lately. Aren't spirits supposed to cling onto your left shoulder?" I got anxious. My dad laughed heartily at my question. "What are you talking about? I don't have anything like that. Your shoulder pain is probably just due to breastfeeding. That's what your mom said. But those two turned out just as you said. That's all just coincidence. People get sick and they have trouble with their boyfriends. But the scam artists, now that's one hell of a coincidence." "Really?" But even at the meeting at the fancy restaurant, those two seemed to recognize the woman with the perm and the one with the brunette hair. They seemed to know something about them. Unable to hold his laughter, my dad replied. "What are you talking about? There are thousands of women with perms and the brunette out there. Then, those two must have been really disliked. They must have realized it themselves. In their minds, images of women with perms and the brunette must have filled their thoughts." I was flabbergasted by my dad, who was laughing while holding his belly. Just as if he was baited by my dad, the baby in my arms gave an angelic smile.